our event. And according to today's program, we shall have some remarks. And I would like to call upon Her Excellency Dr. Amani Asfour to make her remarks.
Your Excellency, Secretary General of the East Africa Community, my brother, Mr. Peter, Your Excellency, Ambassador Albert Mushenga, AU Commissioner for Trade, Industry, Economic Development, Tourism and Mining, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, my sisters and brothers from across all over the continent, captains of industries, private sector, all protocols observed. It's my real pleasure to be here today with all of you in this Thursday of the very constructive Business Private Sector Forum, which really gathered all of us as private sector from different fields and discussed very important sessions with reference to agriculture, agribusiness, energy, regional integration, youth entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs. This is the real Africa. This is the real topics that we need really to discuss among us as private sector. Because the main theme of the conference for regional and continental integration and implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will really never be reached unless we empower our African private sector. That's why as Africa Business Council, which is established by the Heads of State Decision Summit, we are honored to be here to see as an umbrella of the African private sector, how we build the capacity of the private sector and how we can advocate for the conducive environment and the enabling environment and legislation to empower our African private sector. As you all know that our vision is, a founding vision is a competitive, borderless, innovative Africa for trade, investment, and industrialization. Under Africa Business Council, we have more than 20 clusters that's speaking to all the relevant sectors of our continent. So if we're talking about food security, which was one of the main topics, as we mentioned, we are still now importing with $50 billion food, while we have 65% of our arable land. How can you reverse this formula? It's the private sector, really, who can do it. How can we really have all our minerals and the mining, which is really all by all multinational companies, and we don't empower our African private sector? Our healthcare, how we invest in our healthcare. Our digital economy, how we empower our youth and women and SMEs and grow. That's why one of the main sessions of this conference actually, which was with the youth entrepreneurs and the startups, is a huge, really, achievement towards empowering our African startups. And we are very happy to say that Africa Business Council is now in the phase of establishing a fund, Innovate Africa Fund for startups, to see how we invest in our African youth, because our African youth constitute more than 60% of our African population. Women entrepreneurs, which is a very, very important to see how we empower, because it's not about men and women, it's about building the human resources of our African continent. It's a business case. We need to improve increase productivity, so we need to build the capacity of our 100% of our human resources. So as I always say that our strategy is really about the 3 pillars: private sector strengthening, including SMEs, women and youth, and that's by building capacity, awareness, sensitization, information. And the 3rd pillar is about policy advocacy, and I repeat it all the time because we had one of the speakers in our Congress here who say, repeat and repeat and repeat. We need to have at least 40% of all government procurement goes to African private sector. Your Excellencies on the high table, This is a message from the private sector that we needed to be communicated to the heads of state decision summit that the African private sector is advocating to have at least 40% of government procurement goes to African private sector. So whatever on the African soil cannot be brought from outside Africa. And this is actually a huge measure that we are talking. Together with financial inclusion, we have a lot of financial institutions on the continent that should really work together with the private sector to have available funds and available access to our financial resources. The third pillar, which is product development, as you have all seen during the 3 days fruitful discussion of our African Private Sector Forum, that we need to manage our own resources. We have all the natural resources of the world, we have the human resources of the world, and we have brain drain. We have all our scholars going outside the continent because we don't really empower our people of Africa. So we need to see how we link science and technology with industrialization agenda and to have a product of Africa which is high level, competitive, standardized, harmonized, and this is actually our agenda, to have a huge African component, a made in Africa product which is strong and standardized. So this is another message from the African private sector that we need to have harmonization among the standards of the products of Africa, so whatever we register in one country, it can be registered in all the other countries. Of course, we thank all the partners who are with us here. We thank very much our host, East Africa community, and the private sector of Kenya, KEPSA, and CAM, who were we were very happy to be hosted by them here, and also by East Africa Business Council, East Africa Chamber of Commerce. We are here in this beautiful city of Nairobi. Thanks for the government and people of Kenya. And I just want to mention here that Kenya was the first country really to implement the legislation for at least 30% of government procurement goes to SMEs, women and youth. So we need to replicate it across all over the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, the private sector of Africa is there for you. Africa Business Council is there for you. And we are happy to see how our membership under the 20 clusters of the Africa Business Council, we can all work together to realize the Africa we want. As we always say, a prosperous, peaceful, integrated Africa driven by the citizens of Africa. And we are the citizens of Africa. So if nobody will do it for us. It's us as Africans that have African solutions for African problems. We need to build our capacity. All the problems are known and the solutions are known. What is really missing is our cooperation, our collaboration together as African institutions, as government, private sector, civil society, academia. All of us come together to realize one Africa, one voice. And we always say for all of us as our African proverb, and I always say it in all my speeches, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if we want to go far, we go together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. 𝗂𝗓𝗂𝗓. Let's give Dr. 𝗂𝗂𝗓𝗂𝗓 a big round of applause. I would now like to invite His Excellency Peter Mutuku Mathuki. His Excellency Peter Mathuki is the Secretary General of the East African Community. And he is also the co-partner of the African Union Commission in organizing this event. Let's give him also a big round of applause. I now have the honor to invite His Excellency Peter Mutuku Mathuki to make his remarks.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Ambassador Albert Mushaga, Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals, African Union Commission, my good sister, Dr. 𝗂𝗂𝗧𝗛, directors of the East African Business Council who are here in attendance, and indeed the local private sector association, KEPSA, and Kenya Association Manufacturers, Excellencies, ambassadors who are here, captains of industry, all of you invited guests. I'm indeed very much honored to join you this morning, and I want to fully associate myself with the remarks made by Dr. Amani that we have to drive the African agenda. And maybe before I make my remarks, and in the spirit of appreciating that this event, as she has rightly put, is a coordination of many players, I think it's only fair that I invite the East African Business Council. Simon Kahero, if he's here, he can come and speak on behalf of the East African Business Council as directors, and indeed on behalf of the private sector in maybe 2-3 minutes. And therefore now from that, then I proceed with my remarks. So if you are here, please, thank you very much. Let us appreciate him as he comes. Yeah, it is the East African Business Council as the host regional economic bloc in the region. We worked with them as East African community, with the African Union, with the African Business Council, with KEPSA, with CAM, and therefore let's allow them to make some very brief remarks. Most welcome, my brother.
Asante sana. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning once again. First, I'd like to thank our East African Community Secretary General, my brother Dr. Peter Matuki, for gracing us with his presence today and for giving the East African Business Council the opportunity to speak before you here in the heart of East Africa. Please, a round of applause. Our President of the Africa Business Council, Dr. 𝗭𝟰🯬 Ambassador Mchanga, the architect of Africa getting together to do business and trade, it gives us great pleasure as the private sector to sit in this room today, this week, to discuss issues of growing African economies together. And as Dr. Amani has said, the key issue is for us not to go fast, but to go far. However, while planning to go far, it is important that we go fast as well. And this has been the crux of the discussions during the last 3 days. Dr. Matuki, thank you very much for following all the activities that we as the private sector pursue. Of course, you are a key member of putting together the reviving the East African Business Council so that the voice of the private sector is at the forefront. And now we have a much better opportunity as the private sector to speak with governments across East Africa to move these economies, to grow the wealth and prosperity of Africans. And not just the Africans who are represented in this room, very well dressed and doing big business, but those at the very bottom of the pyramid, those who are wallowing in poverty, those who have the opportunity and potential to come out of there and become as wealthy as the people in this room. And our main focus as what we call the private sector is to bring up those small people, the SMEs, the MSMEs, so that, as we said during this week, we don't have SMEs that are SMEs for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. We want to see small businesses become big businesses. We want to see the big African businesses become multinational across the continent first, so that we can go into the rest of this world using the position that we are supposed to have as Africans. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, one of the key resolutions that we expect to come out with at the end of today's session is how we are going to work together as the private sector first, but with the public sector, to ensure that we stop using the word potential, potential, potential. Let's go into actual. And our number one actual opportunity today is the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. If we are clear about what we are going to do, we will actually do it. And if we do it fast, we will go very, very far. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you once again, and I look forward to that resolution being signed. Asante sana.
Thank you very much for that very powerful message. Let us work together. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, I appreciate the East African Chamber of Commerce. I know Charles Kahudu is around. And thank you very much again for working together to ensure that private sector speaks in one voice. Let me extend my appreciation to the government of the Republic of Kenya, not only for hosting us and hosting this very important event, but also for according us all the necessary facilities to ensure that this event is a success. We want to thank again them for making sure that we all feel at home while in Nairobi. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, I know for the last 2 days you've been canvassing as delegates, as private sector and public sector, in different critical areas, sectors, that is finance, digital trade, infrastructure, value chains, climate change, and the empowerment of youth and women. And I know recommendations coming out of this forum will inform the summit of the African Union that is coming up, so that whatever is being discussed here becomes part of the communique of the summit. And I think that is very important. And as again, if you said, Africa, the intra-Africa trade, and I know this is what you've been discussing, intra-Africa trade still remains very low, 80%, and I know you've been discussing this, of our trade still conducted with the rest of the world, meaning that whatever we do, how we do business within Africa, is only slightly below 20%. And I think this is a trend that needs to change. It is not possible that business will continue as usual. We must change that trade. And I think as ourselves, as the East African community, we are committed to ensure that we work with the rest in the region to increase the intra-Africa trade. Within the East African community, for example, the exports between 500,000 to 700,000 jobs annually are being done by boating what could be domestically be produced. Whatever we can be able to produce here, we are losing about 500 to 700,000 jobs annually. And I think it's the high time, and that's what we were discussing before we came here. Can we start promoting local content in the context of our region? And I think that is what will make a difference. As a continent, we must strive to diversify economies beyond even what we call the natural resources. We need to implement policies that focus on diversification of manufacturing sector, the MSMEs, as my brother said. And indeed, we need to see how we could increase the GDP contribution, manufacturing sector's contribution to GDP, from the current around 9% to around 25% by 2032. The East African community seeks to raise the region's local value-added content of resource-based exports from the current this, and that is our focus, supposedly 40%. Friends, just imagine our African continent with a lot of potential. Today, our total GDP as Africa is 3.5 trillion US dollars. Americans alone, they have about 24 trillion US dollars. The Europe, they have about 17 trillion US dollars. And yet, in terms of population, we have 1.4 billion people. We have natural resources. DRC alone, their potential wealth is 26 trillion US dollars if whatever is in DRC is exploited. And therefore is to say, in Africa, African continent, we have potential almost 100 trillion US dollars if Africa is to be fully exploited. And this will not be done by anyone else. It is ourselves as private sector working with government to make sure that we realize the Africa we want. And the Africa we want cannot be Africa of poverty, Africa without jobs. It is Africa, and if we create this, we exploit fully the 100 trillion US dollars. That means creation of jobs, opportunities for our people. And I was challenging our colleagues here when we were coming here. Every single year, we go to the Switzerland to go for the Davos about the economic forum. There is no African agenda in those kind of forums. It's the high time we need, and when you talk of local content, in terms of we need to start our own economic forums in Africa, where Africa is setting the agenda, where Africa sets the agenda for ourselves. Whenever we invest, and I am sorry to say this, we do Africa, Asia, Africa, China, Africa, Russia, Africa, any other continent. it is us enriching the agenda. We need to do the other way around. We need to do every year our own economic forum that promotes the African agenda. And that's how to start. And I think the challenge with us today, and I want to ask my brother, Ambassador Mpchaga, because to provide the leadership and all of us, that going forward, we need now to start investing in having African Economic Forum, where we are setting on our agenda, inviting others to come and listen what we want for our own continent. It cannot be business as usual every other time we're going to other continents, and yet in our own continent, that's where they get resources from. Whatever is developing the rest of the world is coming from Africa. So there's something that is not adding up. Why is Africa not getting developed? And I think this can only be done if we all work together. I like the spirit that on the sidelines of the African Union, we have this kind of engagements, the business summits like this, so that we communicate. We speak with our policymakers, we speak with heads of states, we speak with everyone. And therefore, that way, we shall develop Africa. And therefore, the private sector, you have an important role to play. We need to work together at the national level, at the regional level, at the continental level, speak in one voice. With the principle of inclusivity, you cannot avoid to exclude anyone. We need all to move together going forward. In fact, we as East African community and working with the African Union, we are thinking of even starting Invest Africa as a clear agenda, so that we can now start that campaign of saying the place to invest is Africa. If we all invest in Africa, imagine our people will not be leaving this continent looking for greener pastures out of the continent, but will be getting our jobs. And you know how our people are treated whenever they go out of this continent. Why should we allow that to happen? Yet, captains of industry, you are here. Yet, we are here as governments and, of course, as regional economic blocks to support. And I was giving an example of the services trade. The service sector alone representing over 60% of the world GDP and more than 50% of employment worldwide holds a great potential. This is an area I think we can, all of us, be interested in and start focusing on: the digital trade, the infrastructure. When you travel from one country in Europe to the other, you don't even realize that you're crossing the border. Why should it be so difficult in Africa to simply have one passport written, African passport, and we travel within Africa without necessarily asking for visa when you are traveling within Africa? What is a miracle in this? I think it's the high time we say, let us move in this. At least in the East African community we have started, because every East African, the passport they're holding is written the East African, then the country follows. So I think we need to move forward. We need to remove the barriers of movement of people, because African people, we are one. And once we start putting blocks in terms of movement of people, that's how we now start killing development. So I think it's the high time, working regional economic blocks, working with the African Union, we start focusing on how to enhance movement of people and services within the continent. And I kept on asking, even what we call the currency was so difficult with having a currency, even if we are going to have parallel currency, but one currency that we know we can use for doing business. How do we expect us to exploit fully African continental free trade area, and we don't have a common currency? We don't have a common currency that we can use for doing business. Because if you use different currencies, 54 currencies, what happens? If I change Kenya shillings, I used to buy business, I go to another country like Uganda, by the time I change, the value has gone down by 30%. So I think it's a high time we must bite the bullet by saying we need a common currency. Even if it starts at the regional level, we have a currency in East Africa, East African currency, West Africa, and at the end we come with one currency at the region. That is what will facilitate business. And I think you yourselves as the private sector, you need to come out strongly to support this. Infrastructure is what transforms, and that's my third point. If you want to travel from Paris to London, you take a train and you move. and in 2-3 hours you are in that place. That's a different country. When you want to move from Switzerland to Italy, there is no problem. But now moving within East Africa, you want to go to DRC from Nairobi, you go to Europe, then go to DRC. Or go to West Africa, you have to go through some place. And that is what we are saying. We need as well to start investing in infrastructure. And that is why we were even discussing with the Commissioner Mushaga saying, suppose there was one African airline that now traverses the entire continent. I'm telling you, the cost of transport, air transport, becomes cheap and manageable. And that again facilitates business. And so is communication, common area network. By the time you move into 54 countries, you need to have 54 SIM cards, changing SIM cards, changing from this to another. Why can't we have simply one SIM card, taking care of all the security measures, but we still have one SIM card? Even if it's one area code, the way the United States you start +1, Africa we should start with +2, and then you put your code country wherever it is, so that we make communication easy. And that is what will facilitate business. Therefore, private sector, you have a role to play. We need to work closely, become innovative in some of these ideas going forward. My fourth point is the climate action and green transition. We need to close the gap as a continent, and the private sector, you have a role to play in terms of financing the climate action, because that is what will keep our continent safe and our globe safe from all what we are going through. Therefore, Your Excellencies, I want to make my conclusion remarks by assuring you that the East African community is committed to work with the African Union, but also other regional economic blocs, to transform our continent. And to me, that is, I think, the only way we'll transform if we work together. Captains of industry, you have a challenge ahead of you. And the challenge you have is to ensure we invest money here, not outside our continent. And I think it will be very easy to say in another few years, Africa we want is achieved if we all work together. I urge all of us, the African countries, to emulate and learn, even take lessons from the regional economic blocs that are making progress. As regional economic blocs, we are not here to compete, but complement one another, so that we transform. And whatever we can learn as East Africa, from West Africa, from Southern Africa, from North Africa, we learn. And whatever they can learn from us, they learn from us. And I want to thank all of you for listening and encourage all of us that recommendations that are coming out here, this should be your voice, and this should go to the summit, so that now the private sector is heard going forward. But I look forward also to the next one becomes now an economic summit. It should be an economic forum for Africa. And I think I am ready as East African community to work with all of you to make sure that we transform our continent by not having Davos anymore elsewhere, but having our own Davos in the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency Peter Mathuki. Another big round of applause, please. May I now call upon His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals, to make his remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, the Director of Ceremony. I'll begin by saluting His Excellency Dr. Peter Mathuki, the Secretary General of the East African Community, and Her Excellency Dr. Amani Asfu, the President of the African Business Council, and all of you, the members of the African private sector, and they are also captains of industry. Before I go to my prepared statements, let us reflect on the Africa we have. The Africa we have is one where there is lack of self-confidence. Those of you who disagree with me, raise your hands. The Africa we have is where there is widespread poverty. Those of you who disagree with me, raise your hands. The Africa we have is where there is internal conflict and cross-border conflict. Those of you who disagree with me, raise your hands. None of you have raised your hands. So let us destroy the Africa we have and create the Africa we want. This is the collective task that we have. Government representative, the private sector, each and every African. Now, having said that, let me begin my substantive statement by saying I greet each and every one of you, and I also convey the greetings of His Excellency Dr. Musa Faki Mahamat, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, who was supposed to be with us, but his office is always busy. There are numerous calls to duty across Africa, and therefore he could not be with us until later, maybe on the 14th. And he sends his best wishes for a very fruitful outcome of our deliberations. And on my part, I'm going to ensure that I brief him on the outcome of this meeting, because after this meeting we have the Executive Council and later the media coordination meeting. And like indicated in the earlier opening ceremony, we have been looked after very, very, very well by the people and government of the Republic of Kenya. And we continue to enjoy that hospitality. We treasure it and always really be grateful for it. When we come here, we have a number of people who made it very possible. We have sponsors, and the sponsors are numerous. We thank them very, very much. We also have partners, including the East African community, who are our co-partners. We thank them very much. And of course, without your individual and collective presence, it would not have been possible to have this meeting. So we thank you for your presence and active participation. This was supposed to be a president's session. It will not be possible due to other developments here and there. But from the time we started having the meeting 2 days ago, we have used numerous platforms to ensure that we drive our agenda. We had 10 sessions, including the opening ceremony, which made it possible to dialogue, sometimes in this hall and sometimes in parallel sessions. And I'd like to believe that among each and every one of you, there are possibilities for bilateral networking. And outside of this room, we also had exhibitions which provided a lot of trade information. In addition, we had the masterclass and the pitching event co-organized with Google. And finally, but not the least, last night we had the fashion show. Through the African Union Startup Program, we have a partnership with Google. On the basis of this partnership, the top 3 pitchers during this forum will be assisted by Google to grow their respective businesses. And in the process, they are going to contribute to the growth of the commercial landscape of Africa. And in addition, they contribute to generating jobs for our continent. And from this, it is very clear that startups are key to ensuring that Africa prospers through innovation. And those innovations offer solutions to the numerous but surmountable challenges that we face in Africa and that the rest of the world also faces. The startup activities in Africa will be boosted when the African Business Council comes up, and this is in the very near future, with the Innovate Africa Fund, which is also going to be complemented with funds dealing with biotechnology. And we welcome this very, very, very much. However, as this goes on, there's also an agenda for the governments across Africa and the private sector. Collectively, we need to boost investments in research and development. When this topic comes up in my regular discussions with the African scientists, they always emphasize that boosting expenditure on research and development should not be confined to just salaries and pension benefits of technicians and scientists involved in research and development. It should encompass funding of the actual programs of research and development. And this very valid observation comes against the background that Africa, in our science and technology and innovation strategy, which goes from the period 2013 to 2024, committed to be spending 1% of our GDP, aggregate GDP, on research and development. However, this figure currently stands at 0.5% of the aggregate GDP of Africa. According to the Financial Times, it's a very respected business outlet. It is counseled that research and development spending of 2.4% of gross domestic product is the barest minimum required to effectively compete in this technology-driven world economy. Contrast that 2.4% to the 0.5% that we are currently investing in. And contrast that with the fact that right now, some countries are investing 4.8% to 9% of their gross domestic product on research and development. And some individual companies are investing 5% of their gross annual revenues on research and development. For Africa, this is 0.5%. So we are doing nothing, absolutely nothing. We need to wake up, and this is the part of the Africa we have. We are sleeping in this technology-driven world. Let's come out of that slumber and do what is necessary. And it's my expectation that the next science and technology strategy, which we are going to develop at the African Union Commission, will take that into account and see if we can, at a minimum, commit to spending at least 2.5% of Africa's GDP on research and development. And why is this so? The fact is that technology is the only ingredient left to enable us to realize the aspirations and objectives of the African Union Agenda 2063. Together with the skills development, it is a critical source of productivity and rapid growth. Now, let me pause here for a while and look at China and Africa. Africa's population is about 17.5% of the global population. And China's population is also about 17.5% of the global population. We look at the other metrics. Africa's share of GDP is 3% of the global GDP. China's share is 18%. Africa's share of global trade is 2.7% of global trade, and China's is about 20%. Why the difference? Productivity, productivity, productivity. We need to invest in productivity if we have to realize the Africa we have. And as we do so, we know that we have two critical ingredients that are in our favor. The first ingredient is that we have a young and growing population. And that population is a source of entrepreneurship, it's a source of jobs, and it's a source of consumption. I said right now, we are 17.5% of the global population. Come 2050, we shall be 25% of the global population. Come 2100, we shall be 38% of the global population. And in capital markets, they always remind you, population or demography is destiny. So we have a key ingredient here. The second ingredient are our vast natural resources that we have. My brother here, the Secretary General of the East African Community, gave us statistics on the valuation of DRC's mineral resources. Last year, The Economist magazine categorized Africa as the richest region in the world in terms of natural resource endowment, but the poorest in terms of economic development. So that ingredient is waiting to be harnessed. And therefore, let us lock in science, technology, and innovation, and in the process, we shall be ready to create the Africa we want. Let me at this stage turn to the fashion show. This is a very strategic platform for developing the African textile and clothing industry. However, what is obvious is that this show still lacks the participation of the African and global manufacturers and retailers in clothing. We know this is a challenge, and we are going to address it. And when we do that, one of the key activities we should undertake is that when we have the fashion show, let us bring in retailers in the textile industry. Let us bring in factory owners. And there's also a challenge to all of us gathered here, together with the creative directors, the designers of the African fashion. Are we not in a position to mobilize financial resources to invest in clothing factories across Africa? Are we not in a position to ensure that we mass produce such that if I want a shirt that my brother here is having, all I need is to walk in a shop around the central business district of Nairobi, instead of going to the market to say, can you make this shirt for me? They should be readily available in the shops. And when we do that, we are going to give life to the African fashion industry. Now, what we have been doing here is going to be carried forward. We have what we call the Specialized Technical Committee on Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals. The outcomes are going to go to that committee. And we have decided to dynamize that committee by creating subcommittees on tourism, trade, industry, and minerals. So members of this forum will be invited to participate in both the subcommittee on industry and the STC itself, the Specialized Technical Committee. And after the reports have been considered by the Specialized Technical Committee, they are going to be availed to the Assembly of the African Union Heads of State and Government when they meet in February next year. Now, my colleague and my brother, the Secretary General of the East African Community, raised a very important point. And the point is that there's need for a regular dialogue between the African private sector and the heads of state and government. Not too long ago, in 2017, as part of the implementation of the African Union Agenda 2063 in its first 10-year implementation plan. We came up with the African Economic Platform. But hindsight shows that we did not prepare very well to bring it into existence. We did not consult widely with all the stakeholders so that there could be buy-in. Now, I'm making an undertaking before you that moving forward, and the director responsible for industry, minerals, entrepreneurship, and tourism is here, and the head of division of entrepreneurship and investments are here. If I forget and you remind me, they are going to lose their jobs. And what is my undertaking? My undertaking is this. We shall circulate the documents we prepared to establish the African Economic Platform to all their 8 regional economic communities, to the members of this forum, to the African Business Council, to the Chief Executives Forum of Africa, or the African CEO Forum, the African Development Bank, the African Export-Import Bank, BADIA, the African Trade Insurance Agents, and the regional development banks such as the Trade and Development Bank of the Commercial region. And on the basis of this, we are going to invite all these stakeholders to a meeting to say, out of this, how do we create the African Business Summit, whereby just before the summit, the business leaders across Africa, including all of you, have networking sessions with the heads of state and government and agree on an agenda of driving Africa forward through entrepreneurship and private sector investments. This is the undertaking I make. And when we meet next year, hold me to account. I end here and thank each and every one of you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Albert Muchanga. Can we give him another round of applause, please? Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, what we have now is as a result of your hard work and contributions during the last 2 days. I'm now going to read to you the recommendations, and be assured that all these recommendations will be circulated to each and every one of you. We have your emails, and it will also be circulated to you. So I would kindly request you to listen to these recommendations. The title of the recommendations is 14th African Union Private Sector Forum, 10 to 12 July 2023 in Nairobi, Kenya. Recommendations. We representatives of the business and economic communities from Africa applaud the 14th African Union Private Sector Forum, organized by the African Union Commission in collaboration with the East African Community under the theme Public-Private Sector Engagement for Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Development, while deepening regional and continental trade and investment towards implementation of the AFCFTA from 10 to 12 July 2023 in Nairobi, Kenya. We witness with great pleasure the presence of Honorable Rebecca Miano, Cabinet Secretary of the East African Community, Arid and Semi-Arid Lands and Regional Development in Kenya, His Excellency Ambassador Albert M. Muchanga, Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals, African Union Commission, Honorable Dr. Peter Mutuku Mathuki, Secretary General of the East African Community, and Dr. Amani Asfour, President of the Africa Business Council, who reaffirmed their endeavor to support socio-economic development in Africa. We also acknowledge the presence of Africa Business Association, private sector organizations, international organizations, strategic partners, chambers of commerce, business councils, Union of Industries, Manufacturers Associations, financial institutions, women and youth entrepreneurs, women and youth-led owned creative startups, academia and research institutions, SMEs and academia. We are grateful to the government of the Republic of Kenya and its people for their warm and friendly hospitality accorded to the entire delegation. Having deliberated on key actions to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa towards the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, enhancing access to finance in Africa, exploring financial innovations that reshape economic growth, transforming business model in the global garment industry, the role of clothing, textile, and leather value chain in Africa, the role of digital trade and its implication on African economies, opportunities and challenges, environmental, social, and governance practices among the African private sector, unlocking the potential of youth and women to emerge as successful leaders and entrepreneurs, access to reliable and affordable energy supply, addressing the critical challenge to Africa businesses, crowding in private sector investment in transport, logistics, and infrastructure development and agribusiness and food security. We agreed on the following recommendations. With regards to the first item, which is key actions to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa towards the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, we have recommendations to African Union member states. There is need to strengthen public-private dialogue, accountability, and feedback mechanisms through public-private collaborations in upscaling economic and social development, as well as bridging infrastructure gaps and services. Member states are encouraged to adopt favorable policies, including removing non-tariff barriers, promotion of regional and continental value addition, and embrace technology for ease of information asymmetry, and ensure inclusion of Africa business champions in the African Union economic policy making agenda within the framework of the AU Private Sector Forum. To the regional economic communities, encourage best practices and knowledge sharing among RECs in Africa, develop a database of private sector enterprises producing standardized and quality products and services and market their respective brands. Develop policies that facilitate linkages between science and technology with industrialization. Promote an enabling environment towards accelerating the market penetration of startups anchored on innovation, and promote regional value chains that strengthen linkages between regional and continental markets. To the African Union Commission, create an online platform of Africa's investment opportunities to facilitate engagement with private sector actors, strengthen skills development to meet aspiration of the private sector towards accelerating investments and growth in Africa, and create an African Research and Development Annual Forum to push towards accelerated industrial transformation. To the private sector actors, enhance innovation through research and technology to boost its productivity with focus on manufacturing. Ensure philanthropic capital is blended with private capital to generate more capital for SMEs and enterprises doing social good, and create a platform of African champions to foster meaningful public-private partnerships, dialogue to accelerate Africa-to-Africa trade and investment. Under the second agenda item, which is enhancing access to finance in Africa, exploring financial innovations that reshape economic growth, to African Union member states, ensure we collect, analyze, and utilize data with adequate reporting towards informing economic policies, decision-making processes on SMEs. Develop an inclusive governance participatory mechanism on innovative monetary policies towards creating greater financial inclusion in Africa, create the necessary enabling environment for Africa SMEs to benefit from existing venture capitalist funds in Africa, develop a central bank digital currency to facilitate financing towards SMEs, and provide commercial-centric business support to ensure sustainability of SMEs' competitiveness, focusing on women in trade. To lenders, adopt simplified credit rating and performance-based instrument application for SMEs to enhance their credit worthiness. To the African Union Commission, develop an AU model law to clearly define SMEs and the various instruments they can benefit from. To private sector actors, strengthen the technical capacity of SMEs on how to pull crowdfunding and venture capitalist funds into their businesses. With regards to this third agenda item, which is transforming business model in the global garment industry, the role of clothing, textile, and leather value chain in Africa. To AU member states, develop innovative centers in the 5 African regions to promote African fashion based on the common cultural identity. Adopt policy to ban the importation of second-hand clothes on account of their deleterious impact on the garments and apparel home industry and their health-related negative effects on people. Adopt appropriate policies that support the development of the value chain. Invest substantial budgetary resources in the garment and apparel sector while emulating the best practices to countries that have taken this path, such as those in East Asia, and other parts of the world. Adopt policies to promote Made in Africa and provide competitiveness support to the textile industry in order to foster participation of African textile champions within the global value chains. To the African Union Commission, promote the consumption of local African textiles through the integration of African fashion shows into major African events. To private sector actors, African designers need to be consistent in their products to effectively compete on the international market and encourage African offshoring of African brands elsewhere in Africa. Under item 4, which is the role of digital trade and its implication on African economies, opportunities and challenges, these are recommendations. To the African Union member states, adopt the development of electronic payment and settlement systems and harmonize user fees on mobile money payments. Promote public-private partnerships in order to leverage limited resources, skills, and technology. Promote the uptake of digital literacy and other critical skills and business-to-people network. Encourage mindset change on products made in Africa, as well as develop and harmonize digital portals in order to improve content and quality of products at both regional and continental levels. Expedite the negotiations on the African Continental Free Trade Area Protocol on digital trade and customized data policy to support the uptake of e-commerce and associated transactions. Diversify products in tourism and other promising sectors, and develop a conducive regulatory and compliance framework that facilitates e-commerce. To the African Union Commission, develop a strategy for Africa to invest in data and cloud infrastructure in order to be part of the global data value chain. And to private sector actors, develop simplified e-payment wallets in Africa for inclusive online businesses and reduce the digital divide between urban and rural internet penetration rate upon investing on enabling soft internet access to infrastructure. Under item E, which is environmental, social, and governance practices among the African private sector, overview of preliminary findings of the AU survey on the status, opportunity, and challenges of climate change. This is about the climate change. To aid African Union member states, take advantage of opportunities presented by the circular economy, capture and business sustainability, and including balancing economic, social, and environmental governance. Promote policies and regulatory which build efficiency and promote guidelines that propel innovation to scale, especially in area recycling and waste use. Promote policies that nurture digital technologies in waste management to attract investors. Work closely with other stakeholders to reflect and design models of development which balance social, economic, and environmental sustainability. Provide tax incentives to leverage private sector actors to comply with environmental, social, and governance standards. improve carbon trading regulations within AU member states, and develop a greener and unique African industrialization agenda through combined public-private dialogue. To the African Union Commission, develop an African Union environmental, social, and governance guidelines to facilitate towards private sector actors access to carbon credits and to export abroad. To private sector actors, undertake capacity building for environmental, social, and governance in order to build climate resilience systems across African governments and obtain environmental, social, and governance certification in order to facilitate access to carbon credits and to export into the global value chain. Under item F, which is youth and women entrepreneurs, unlocking the potential of youth and women to emerge as successful leaders and entrepreneurs, to African Union member states, invest in entrepreneurship training and encourage startups for youth in order to create meaningful employment, coupled with technical and vocational training focusing on skills-based training, and establish special initiatives that respond to the need of the youth, including technical assistance in product standardization, creation of both public and private guarantee funds, as well as increasing the footprints of African venture capital funds to accompany youth and women entrepreneurs. To the African Union Commission, develop guidelines to foster implantation of startups in Africa to merge as successful youth and women entrepreneurs. To the private sector actors, adopt best practice of successful incubation hub models that have been successful, such as those in Singapore and China, to ensure that youth are empowered to create employment and grow the private sector on the continent. Under item G, which is access to reliable and affordable energy supply, addressing the critical challenge to African businesses. These are recommendations to African Union member states: mobilize additional financing towards enhancing the participation of independent power producers upon providing subsidies and other incentives as to increase energy access in Africa. Ensure technologies are upgraded to address power leakages that arise from poor metering and delayed replacement of meters. Member states should on regular basis invest in essential energy infrastructure, at the same time remove barriers to private investors with interest in this sector. Broaden conventional financing options, including development strategies for accessing blended finance and climate finance. Member states are encouraged to implement policies and regulatory frameworks to address issues of affordability and sustainability of power supply. To the African Union Commission, develop guidelines to accelerate mobilization of additional resources to accompany private sector actors to participate in IPPs within the energy sector in Africa. To private sector actors, develop a community of best practice sharing and networking amongst the IPP enterprises in Africa. Under item H, which is crowding in private sector investment in transport, logistics, and infrastructure development, these are recommendations. To the African Union member states, there is need for African Union member states to develop appropriate policies and programs in support of transport and logistics. Member states should mobilize resources to invest in high priority areas of infrastructure to augment private sector investment through public-private partnerships and other financing options, including securitization beyond traditional financing mechanisms, especially debt, and infrastructure investment should look at the whole value chain of a product and should also consider regional interconnectivity to facilitate movement of goods, especially in the context of the one continental market. To the African Union Commission, develop the necessary regulatory and de-risking instruments and incentives to facilitate the implantation of public-private partnerships in Africa. To the private sector actors, undertake actions to put in place mechanisms to address infrastructure development and economic sustainability across all African Union member states. Under item I, which is our last item, agribusiness and food security, these are recommendations to African Union member states. Policies need to be designed to encourage intra-Africa trade in food production by, among others, removing non-tariff barriers which currently make imports from outside the continent compared to locally produced food. Climate change is impacting production on the continent. There is need to invest in irrigation agriculture, moving away from the reliance on rain-fed agriculture. Policies should be put in place to make agriculture attractive to the youth to ensure increased production and reduce food insecurity. Member states are encouraged to build resilient food systems which are climate resilient by employing technologies which promote investments in technology that also address post-harvest losses. Public-private partnerships should be encouraged through the promotion of partnerships for ensuring sustainable financing and management, national and regional agro-industrial parks and regional value chains. Member states should also be encouraged to align their agribusiness priorities in line with the Malabo and Maputo declarations and comprehensive African agricultural development program. Investment in transport and logistics should be supported to ensure agribusiness are scaled up and sustainable to ensure food security in the African continent. Member states should address the teething challenges of non-tariff barriers which impede cross-border trade in agricultural products and raise their prices artificially. Integrate mini-grid energy systems to fast-track agribusiness investment in Africa. Facilitate access to land title for farmers in Africa in order to facilitate access to credit towards agripreneurs. And foster the implantation of agribusiness industrial agglomerations at the national cross-border and continental levels upon factoring SMEs within the process. To the African Union Commission, develop guidelines to foster best practices and knowledge sharing regarding feasible public-private partnership projects in Africa. And to private sector, develop a community of best practices and knowledge sharing for African enterprises participating in public-private partnership projects in Africa. Acknowledgement, the forum expresses its gratitude to the government and the people of the Republic of Kenya for successfully hosting the 14th African Union Private Sector Forum, and the forum that one now we want to hear from one of you. If you can adopt the recommendations, then I will read the last recommendations.
Just three small additions. Let me move closer. On page 2, under African Union member states, let us add a new D, which is there's need to facilitate 40% procurement by the African private sector in all public and infrastructure projects. Yes. Then on page 3, under B to AU member states, let us mention creation of 3 funds. The first one is the Africa Innovate Fund. The second one is the Africa Medical Fund. And the third one is the Advanced Healthcare Fund. Africa, the Advanced Healthcare Fund. Towards the end there, page 9, on top of acknowledgement, put a new subheading under taking. And there we specifically mentioned that the AUC undertook to consult widely on the need to either revive the African Economic Platform or replace it with the African Business Summit. Okay? Yeah.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for these recommendations. They will also be included in the recommendations. We also have another recommendation, which I think it's already there. It is the same, so it's on African Economic Business Forum to happen yearly on the island. There is okay, so we'll see how we can do it. So now may I, at least if you allow me to ask one of you to adopt, and then we.
I propose that we adopt the recommendations with the amendments as read.
as private sector, we second the recommendation. Thank you very much.
Can we also get from one of the private sectors also? Yes, please, my sister. You can just speak loudly.
Sorry, you have a mic. We have forgotten. We have members of parliament.
Yes.
From East Africa who are here. Just your voice or your mic.
Thank you very much. I was saying I'm Françoise Umukiza, as I have been here since Sunday even, in Nairobi, as I thank the host country, Nairobi, and all the dignitaries here. I would like to say the audience and the dignitaries that I didn't heard from the recommendations about the tasks of parliamentarians. I'm here, I would like to advocate for the task of parliamentarians, because without the partnership we are been talking of PPD, all of this, and I was invited by the private sector, of course, EAC, and I work closely with EAC as the region, but as an assembly I represent. I think it's a good opportunity to be given some tasks as well, or if not possible, to organize a meeting, the soonest the better, for this audience, this meeting, to meet with parliamentarians. It's very important. We have been talking of legislators here. The legislation part of it is missing in the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will add one recommendation to involve.
Because all the legislation that we are requiring for the facilitation of the private sector really has to be coming from the parliamentarians. That's why as Africa Business Council, we already addressed the PAP, the Pan-African Parliament in Johannesburg, with our recommendation of 40% government procurement for African private sector, women, youth, and SMEs. So I think the role of parliamentarian is huge for this, and the legislative power is huge for facilitating the incentives and the facilitation for private sector. So thank you very much for this recommendation.
Thank you very much. With these few remarks, we now adopt the recommendations. Please, let's take a big round of applause. No. Now, we have come to the closing of our session, and I would like to call upon His Excellency Peter Mathuki to make his opening remarks. Closing remarks, sorry.
We have to restart afresh. But I thank you very much. Let me, in a very special way, thank all of you, dignitaries, for all of you attending this very important event here in Nairobi, hosted to support and promote the role of private sector in development. I want to thank the Republic of Kenya, the government, for making it possible, for giving facilities that we've been using for the last 2 days to ensure that the event is a success. I want to thank the African Union through Mr. Mushanga himself, who is a champion of private sector. And I have interacted with him closely. And in fact, on the sidelines of the African Union Summit held in February, is when we agreed that this should be held here in Nairobi. And I want to thank you, Your Excellency Ambassador Albert Mushanga, for keeping your word and really going forward. We need to be doing things not only even in East Africa, but even in other regional economic blocs. Let me thank the private sector, the African Business Council, the East African Business Council, the KEPSA, Kenya Association Manufacturers, for cooperating and working closely with us to make sure that this event is a success. I want to thank the organizing teams from the African Union, of course led by Swale. Thank you very much for a job well done. My own colleagues at the EAC, led by the Deputy Secretary General Annette Shizia, please raise, and Flavia. This, and indeed it was to demonstrate the power of women when they hold something. And look at it, how it has gone. Thank you very much for doing a wonderful job. And I think this is the beginning. Let us now walk the talk. This is enough. I thank you, my sister, Francois, for coming to represent the members of parliament. And I know how passionate you are when you come to matters of business and private sector. Let us work together. It's the high time that we must think that no one else will develop Africa. It is ourselves collectively. And we cannot be singing and meetings without action. And I think this is a turning point. I'm happy one of the key recommendations is now going forward. We'll be having the African Economic and Business Forums every year. And I think that is a way forward to set our own agenda as Africa. Let me thank, of course, the facilitators who have been here. I've seen my senior and good brother Bagamohonda, who is here, who is a very important resource. He's been our director of the East African community, and he's a brilliant chap. I can tell you, we have brains in Africa. And using this kind of resources, I'm telling you, it becomes easy to move forward our continent. And all of you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, please take this message to Africans, to the citizens, because all that we do for our people in Africa. And what we want is the Africa we want. You've heard from Commissioner Mushanga on the Africa we want. The Africa we want, we must transform it. And it is ourselves to do it. I thank you very much, and I want to wish all of you a happy stay in Nairobi. We have been meeting for the last 3 days. I know you've not had time to interact with the society, with the people, with the tourism and events in town. Please take time and tour around and see what Nairobi or Kenya is able to offer. And we need to be doing this whenever we go. And for our friends, ambassadors, your excellencies who have created time to come, we want to thank you for creating time to come and be with us. You are our partners. Help us to transform Africa. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Peter Mathuki, Secretary General of the East African Community. Can we give him another round of applause, please? And I think that His Excellency Peter Mathuki also talked on behalf of all members here at the high table. And with that regard, we shall now move to our next session, which is going to be a photo session. And I would like members, first of all, members at the podium to stand so that we take a photo. Members who are also seated, please stand. We will take photo from where you are. Yes. Yes. So our next agenda item is, of course, touring of the exhibitions. So I think we should also try to promote the exhibitors. And they'll be nice. Okay, and I want to thank all of you and bon voyage. Yeah.